It's distinctly strange not to be able to look at an audience, but this is the first and hopefully last time we are doing the Postdoctoral Fellows Research Symposium in this virtual way. Everybody knows what has necessitated this. I feel like I should apologize, but it's the reason we have to do this is no fault of anybody at the Earth Institutes. We always have a choice with events of this sort between cancelling them all together or trying to do the best we can in a virtual way. So we decided to do this one as a virtual one. The talks are pre-recorded, but you'll see them as if they were presented in person, and there will be an opportunity for questions. My name's John Mutter. I'm the director of the program, and everything that happens because of Samantha Ostrowski, who's a superb support for this program. So I can take no credit for any of this, any of the technical necessities and the program format and production. So we do these, I think a number of you will be familiar with this, but we do these little symposia twice a year, one each semester. And what you'll see are 5 quite different presentations. These are not everybody in the program. The program's more than twice as large as this. But we have, it's a 2-year program, so we'll have people in the first year and people in the second year. And, hopefully you'll find all the presentations interesting and diverse. There's no strong theme other than they represent areas of interest to the study of sustainable development in its many different forms. So that's all I'm going to say. So I think we need to get the ball rolling with the first presentation.
Great. So we're going to start with Ben Bales, whose presentation is called Fake Data for Solving Real Problems. And let me pull it up, and we'll take questions via the chat box, and then we'll ask the questions after the presentation is over. Okay, here we go.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ben. I'm a postdoc. I work for Andrew Gelman. Mostly work on the STAN project. That's a probabilistic programming language that Andrew and crew have been doing for a while. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but we will get to use it later, which is exciting. The title of this talk is using fake data for solving real problems. And it's a bit of a clickbaity title, so let me explain where that came from. It's just something that whenever I see it in the wild, I think, oh, that's cool. And so I thought maybe if I gave a presentation on it, you guys would enjoy it as well. So fake data for solving real problems, what do I mean by that? So sort of in comparison to fake data, sort of the standard like Bayesian paradigm of the world is that we're going to have a model and we're going to have data, and we're sort of going to smash these two things together, and we're going to learn about the world. And we're going to learn about the world in terms of parameter estimates, and we're doing the Bayesian thing, so we get little uncertainties on them. And sort of the thing that happens in sort of any modeling problem is you realize that your model is wrong, and there's that box quote, George box, maybe, I don't know, there's that quote that's like all models are wrong, some are useful or whatever. And so you hit that very quickly whenever you're out doing any sort of modeling thing. It's like you have a model, the world looks wonderful, you're so excited to get out and collect data, and then you do, and then you smash your model and your data together, and everything sort of goes to hell because you realize your model is wrong, and you start wondering like, oh, should I expand my model this way? Should I add this to my model? Should I take that away from my model? Like, do I need to be collecting more data? Do I need to be collecting different kinds of data? Do I need to be working with a different model? And like, basically any problem, you sort of start with something that's clean and simple. I'm going to take some model and some data and learn something about the world. And you end up with like this much more complicated or much more complicated situation, which is I've got a bunch of models. I've got a bunch of different sort of ways to look at my data. They're not all totally consistent with each other. How do I sort of like pick and choose and put it all together and do that learning about the world thing? And this is in contrast to a fake data world. And a fake data world is one where you assume you know your model. So that's different than the real world. You assume you know how to parameterize your model, and you assume you know values for the parameters of your model. And sort of the thing you can do now is take the parameters you know, generate data from your model, and sort of take that data and sort of fit it in any way you want and see how close you got to the truth. And sort of the message of this, the message that I want to send is that weirdly enough, this is where it's fun, weirdly enough, even though our original problem was that sort of, all models are wrong and we don't know anything about the world. A lot of the problems that come up when all models are wrong and we don't know anything about the world, you can sort of address with the fake data world, where you just assume you know a model. So it's kind of weird that, the problem of model uncertainty, you can maybe work around it by doing some model certainty stuff. So let me share my screen and I'll just talk you through an example that I saw in the wild once. And that should basically do it for the presentation. So I got to draw you a little picture here. So let me get that set up. There we go. Okay, so this is a problem that came up on the Stan forums. A guy asked a question, and his question was, he had some sort of factory, and in this factory he was making widgets or whatnot, and sort of over time in this factory he had reason to believe that sort of over time in the course of a day or something like that, that's what I'm imagining. The x-axis here is 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. More and more widgets would sort of come off the assembly line broken. And I think the way he posed the problem was sort of a rate problem. So maybe it's at the beginning of the day, the machines are all well calibrated and they're pumping out widgets high efficiency and all the widgets are great. And then at the end of the day, things have come out of alignment and stuff's breaking. Or maybe, there's a human element, people are getting tired. Either way, he wants to model this relationship between failures or failure rates and time, and it's some sort of non-parametric curve that sort of wiggles around, not a straight line or anything. Anyhow, he has a model for this. Whenever he comes to the Stan forums, he has a model for this. So he has an idea of how the world works, and he's taken his data and he's done the thing where he takes the model and the data and smashes them together and he's gotten results. And the follow-up question to that is the sort of his follow-up question to that was he'd done that, he'd built a model, he'd taken some data, he'd squished them together, but he was a little bit uncomfortable because sort of I plotted these data points as if I knew where they were exactly, but sort of actually the situation that he encountered in his process was sort of things were collected in bins. So sort of the data he was measuring was sort of discretized in the x-axis, because he sort of and that's sort of a reflection of if so he didn't really, for any one of these data points, he didn't really know the exact time to associate with it. So each one of his failure measurements, he didn't have an exact time to associate with it. And so what he was doing was, the time of this failure was sometime between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. Well, I'll just call it 9:30 and plug that into my model. And so sort of his question was am I sort of losing, am I sort of over certain in my answer because I'm not representing this uncertainty in the sort of the actual measurement process. And his question was how to expand his model to sort of account for the fact that he doesn't exactly know the sort of time value for any one of these red points, it's sort of a range. And so this is his model expansion problem. He has his original model, he has his data, and now he's got his model expansion, and he's wondering like how to do this. And so we can, we can figure out how to do that or whatever. We can think through it. In this case, it's a little bit tricky because it was a little bit tricky technically because of all these wiggly lines, but and the way non-parametrics work. But sort of the real question to ask here is like, what's it gonna tell him if he has his simple model and he has his complicated model and he does the fit? How does he know one fit is better than the other? Like it's not totally trivial how to do that. Maybe some sort of like cross validation out of sample prediction is about the best thing you can do, but still, like, what if things are close? Like, should he favor the more complex over the simple model? Like, is there any reason to? Well, we do sort of believe the real world is more complicated, but why would we believe that the real world is sort of more complicated in this specific way? Like, all these models are wrong. Both these models are wrong. Why would sort of he favor one or the other? And so, whenever I talked to Andrew about this problem, he sort of said, well, this is a fake data situation. Like, just think of how like to do this with fake data. Like, can't you just like simulate from the complicated model and sort of fit to the simple model and see if you even need to do this? And so that's the advice that we gave the guy, and I don't know, he never got back to us. Presumably it either worked and he was happy, or it didn't work and he thought we were idiots. But let's actually, and let me check the time real quick. Let's actually, yeah, this is great. Let's actually just go through the process of doing the fake data simulations like Andrew suggested. So our process is we're going to have a factory. We're going to be producing things over time, and we want to figure out what uncertainty in the X measurements means, and we're going to sort of infer a line, and we're going to try to figure out what uncertainty in our X measurements mean in terms of our inference procedure. So let's just assume that our factory is a line. Like, over time, we get more and more failures. It's all a straight line. So we're going to have a slope. We're going to have an intercept. We're going to have an x-axis. And so this is going to represent times. And we're going to have measurements. So this is sort of the idealized simple model. Intercept. So we've got a line. This is the mean. We're going to generate random numbers around a mean with some intercept. So that's a line. Let's plot this. Times failure. Boink. Okay, so there we go. Our day, let's say maybe this is 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. We're producing things, and our rate of failures are going up, and we sort of have noisy measurements about this line. Okay, let's do a fit of this model. This is where we're using Stan, and I sort of cheated and have this rewritten beforehand, but we load up a model. We load up a model. We run a fit, and we look at results. Okay, so from the data, we're trying to estimate a slope and an intercept, and sort of our posterior quantiles, sort of in the 90% posterior interval. Our truth was 1, so it's somewhere in that interval. Like, well, didn't totally have to be in that interval, but like it is, so that's great. We're sort of getting reasonable answers that are sort of what we expected. Our intercept, again, our inferential procedure is telling us it's probably somewhere in this range. Like, yeah, I don't know, it's 0.25, whatever, good enough for government work. And so let's get back to our question at hand. And that is not if we generate data from a model and fit it to exactly the same model, does this work? Like, this sort of like, if we're doing our Bayes stuff right, this sort of has to work. Let's pretend that we're making noisy measurements of our x's of our times. So let's do something like this, and let's visualize what noisy measurements mean. Great. Okay, so let's generate noisy measurements. And okay, so again, over here on the plot, the black circles, that's our actual measurements. And now our red circles, we've got sort of noise in our X component. And those are the red circles wiggled around. And so we can take our our inferential procedure and we can repeat the fit. So I guess we've already got the model loaded. Can run our fit with our new sort of jittered X measurements. We can look at the summary, and perhaps unsurprisingly, our slope, the true value was 1. I don't know. This is kind of in the range of 1. I don't know, good enough for government work. We're kind of getting close. You can sort of formally repeat this process so many times, and you can formally repeat this process a bunch of random times, generating new data, doing new fits, and sort of see the frequency with which you sort of capture the truth in your posterior quantiles. But whatever, this is good enough. Intercept, again, sort of like our correct answer is 0.25, so whatever, close enough. And we can imagine as we make this error bigger and bigger, the truth is gonna let's just make it obscenely big. And let's also make the assumption that sort of we know we're measuring times here, so we sort of know that we're not gonna measure any data points before 0 and after 1. So let's sort of just code that into our fake data generation process here. So huge amount of errors. We look at the plot. Our actual true measurements were the black things. What we're actually getting are the red things. And we can sort of see what's going to happen here. A fit of a line to these things is sort of going to be garbage. Unsurprisingly, we look at the results. Again, slope and intercept. We look at the posterior quantiles. Okay, the actual answer was 1. This is starting to be way off. The actual answer was 0.25. This is starting to be way off. All right, so things failed. But this isn't really surprising. This is sort of the point of the guy's question was. He sort of knew this was going to happen. If his X measurements were bad enough, he knew he was going to get a bad answer. And if his X measurements were good enough, he knew he was going to basically be okay with his simple model. And so the question is, how does he know he needs to do the model switch? How do we sort of use fake data to solve this? Well, basically, we can automate the thing we just did right here and make a big plot. And on the x-axis, we're going to plot level of uncertainty. On the y-axis, we're going to plot sort of our parameter estimates. And because we're working in a fake data world, we're going to know the truth, and we can plot the truth as well and sort of see the effect of our the noise on our load more packages on our. That's my timer. Stop timer. We can sort of see the effect of our error measurements on our ability to recover the truth in this simple situation. Okay, so here we go. X-axis is the amount of errors. 0 means no error, so we're fitting the same model we use to generate the data. Teal is our slopes. Pink are our intercepts. And we can sort of see from this plot exactly what happens as we have more and more and more error in our time measurement. And we can see sort of the range in which our approximation doesn't matter. We can see the range in which maybe we could do a little correction. And we can see the range in which we better figure out a new way to make our X measurement. There's not going to be any statistical model that fixes your situation over here. Because we remember from the graph as well, if you can't measure your X correctly, then the relationship between X and Y, nothing you're going to be able to do. Okie dokie. That's all I had. Fake data for solving real problems, particularly model expansion. If anyone has any questions, please ask. And thank you. I'll just tell a quick story and then let the next presentation happen. Another situation where this came up recently was somebody came to us specifically with the coronavirus model. So it was like a differential equation model. They were basically like, oh, this model's super slow. Is there anything we can do to speed it up? And whenever you're solving ODEs, the standard way to speed it up is solve your ODE to a lower tolerance. And then the question becomes if I solve my ODE that's part of my statistical model to a lower tolerance, how does that affect my inference? And you can imagine doing like this exact same procedure is how you can really simply answer that really complicated question. Like, how does an ODE tolerance influence statistics, like a Bayesian inference? Like, you're never going to be able to solve that in closed form or understand it, but you can do really simple computational experiments where you generate data from the high quality model and then fit it to successfully lower quality models. And it's just like, I mean, this is like, originally when this, like, the factory problem came up, like, I was really struggling on like just the technicalities of how we're going to expand this model. And it was Andrew that pointed out, like, don't worry about it, man. Just do this little, just do this other thing and be done with it.
You're trying to infer what the structure of the Earth is like, and what you've got is a very irregular distribution of earthquakes and an equally irregular distribution of seismometer stations recording them. And you've got travel times and amplitudes that are measured pretty well, but not perfectly. And you're trying to infer by generating data, comparing it to what you've got, using, then modifying the model until you get it, as close as you can. And Bayesian methods are being used for that. It's cool, kind of cool stuff.
All right, cool beans. Well, I guess if there aren't any questions, then on to the next one.
Well, I actually have a quick question, Ben. So John sort of spoke to how this type of modeling helps with earthquakes and seismology. Are there any other sustainable development problems that you're working on, and how does what you do help answer questions in this space?
Well, me specifically, I work most of my, so I work on STAN, and like the question of, and STAN is a piece of software for doing Bayesian inference. So sort of, yes, we think that Bayesian inference has applications everywhere. And STAN is, we think, like, we think it's the best way to do Bayesian inference stuff. And if it isn't, please tell us if there's a better way, because we will try to improve our software package. And so, like, I don't work on, most of the things I work on are tooling and stuff. So they aren't like directly, applications, like I'm not like directly writing an application, but in support of these projects and stuff, like I do STAN. And hopefully that applies generally.
Awesome, great, thanks so much. All right, so we're going to move on then to Pilar Fernández, who's working on exploring the ecosocial interactions influencing human exposure to ticks and tick-borne diseases. So again, bear with me as I get the video started, and we'll take questions again through chat, and Pilar is here to answer questions at the end.
Welcome everybody. I'm Pilar Fernández. I'm in my last year of this Earth Institute Postdoctoral Fellow. So I wanted to take this opportunity to present the project that I've been working on during my time at the Earth Institute. This is an ongoing project, so I'm also going to be showing some of the future plans that we have. So the main objective of this project is to explore the ecological and social factors and how they interact to influence human exposure to ticks and the risk of acquiring a tick-borne disease. We are conducting this research here on Staten Island in New York City. So first I want to start by thanking the people involved in this research. My PI and advisor, Maria Diop-Wasser, and Meritijn Akker, who's a PhD student at the lab, and she is leading some of the work on the ecological side. I also want to thank Casey Ernst, Mary Hayden, Holly Gaff, and Kevin Berry for co-PIs in this project. So first I wanted to just give a quick overview of the problem of tick-borne diseases here in the United States. As of 2018, tick-borne diseases represented 76% of all vector-borne diseases reported in the United States, with Lyme disease being the most important one. But also, as you can see in the graph, the incidence has been increasing over the last decade, and so did the geographic distribution of the disease. So I'm going to focus on Lyme disease because it's the main tick-borne disease here, particularly in the Northeast. And so I want to give just a quick overview without going into too many details about the transmission cycle. So Lyme disease is transmitted by the black-legged tick, also known as the deer tick. And you can see on the right the 3 life stages of the tick, going from larvae to nymph to adult. Usually larvae, when they hatch from the egg, they're not infected, and they acquire the infection by feeding on an infected animal that is usually small mammals, or it could also be birds. Each life stage needs to feed on a host to mold into the next stage, and so there's a chance that they can acquire the infection or pass it to an uninfected animal. Deer play an important role in the life cycle because that's where the adults mate, and the female tick acquires a large blood meal so she can lay the eggs. Humans and domestic animals are what we call dead-end host because they don't participate directly on the transmission cycle, but they can be bitten by a tick and acquire the infection. And so one of the first questions we want to answer is, how is the tick density and Lyme disease cases associated? So we know that, for example, the more ticks you have in the environment, the higher the chances that you're going to find one. But it really also depends on how humans get exposed to the vectors. So it really will depend on human behavior and the protective measures that they use. So, and the density of infected nymphs, it's going to respond to environmental factors, but also host availability. And as I mentioned, there's a wide range of hosts that the ticks can feed on a wide range of hosts. So host community composition and how the different hosts move through the landscape and use the habitat, it's going to be an important factor. So we're approaching this project by modeling, thinking about couple of natural and human systems, and basically the systems we separate the natural system, which is in this case the enzootic transmission cycle that involves the ticks and non-human hosts, and then the human system, which involves obviously humans and all the different factors that involve and determine their behavior. And what we're thinking is that these systems are connected through different processes, and therefore there are feedback loops, and that will determine the dynamics over time. So we have the enzootic transmission cycle. We can divide it into 2. We have the transmission cycle in natural areas and the transmission cycle in the yards and pre-domestic areas. And those are related by non-human host movement and habitat use. So the number of ticks in this environments, it's going to determine the individual exposure to ticks. But as I mentioned before, this is also going to be governed by the activity patterns and the personal protection measures that they use. And how do humans affect the natural transmission cycle? Well, by doing interventions and their investment choices. And they can intervene in their yards, for example, by spraying the yard against ticks, or doing community level interventions like deer control. And the sum of all the individual decisions that people make, it's going to determine the Lyme disease risk or the incidence in a community. As I mentioned, we're focusing on Staten Island because it's the most affected borough as determined by Mutter in 2017. So just a quick overview, and I'm not going to go into too many details, but the enzootic transmission cycle, as I mentioned, it's being studied by Meredith in her PhD thesis, and it basically involves to better understand how movement, habitat use, and tick burden of the different species, host species, for example, deer and small mammals like the white-footed mice that you see in the picture, affect the distribution and density of ticks in parks. So this is kind of a short video of how we sample for ticks. Basically, that's called tick dragging, and we collect questing ticks, or the ones that are looking for a host. So going into more of what I'm doing, the enzootic transmission cycle, I'm focusing on the enzootic transmission cycle in the yards. And I'm doing household visits by selecting houses around the high-risk areas around the parks. And when we visit these households, we look for ticks in the yards, as I mentioned, and we do interviews to people, knowledge added to some practice surveys to collect epidemiological information. And in 2018, we sampled 129 yards, and in 2019, 135. What we found is that a third of the yards surveyed had at least one tick, although you can see there's difference between 2018 and 2019. Ixodes scapularis is the black-legged tick, but we also found 2 other tick species. Amblyoma americanum, which is the monster tick and can transmit other diseases, and Amaphysalis, which is an invasive tick that so far doesn't cause any disease here in the US. So with this information, the next step that I'm working on actually right now is to model the tick presence in the yard as a function of the yard features that we collect when we go and do the tick sampling, like for example, the presence of fences, the presence of flower, vegetable gardens, and brush piles, and other things. And then also involving landscape and environmental variables using the land cover classification that we have at different distances to understand how they are connected to the parks and if there is actually suitable habitat around them. And the other important aspect of this research is to better understand the human dimension of disease. So during those KP surveys that I mentioned, we collect some information about what are the adaptive behaviors that people have. And we have 3 types, we can identify 3 types of behaviors: avoidance, and they avoid risk areas, for example, not going into the parks. And we actually found that a third of the people are avoiding risk areas. People can still go to those places and use protective measures to reduce risk. And we found that a third of people don't use any. But also that adjusting clothing is, for example, using long sleeve shirts and long pants. It's what they use, and we know that it's not particularly effective. And there's also mitigation things that they can do, for example, spraying in the yard and deer control, which I'm gonna talk about a little bit later. So we think that obviously past exposure to ticks is gonna affect risk perception and what they know about the disease, particularly tick identification. And we think that risk perception and knowledge are related, and it's also influenced by what their neighbors know, their past experience with ticks, and the social norms. So this is going to influence how people use personal protection measures, and it's going to affect, in turn, how people get exposed to ticks. So we asked people about how serious they think the problem is, and 70% of the people think that actually it's a very serious disease. But when we ask about the individual risk perception, this is actually pretty low. And you can see in the graph on how likely it is that you will acquire Lyme disease in the next 2 years. And that's actually, most of the people said that it's unlikely, very unlikely. But we found a wider range of responses when we asked them about their risk of tick bites. And when we cross these 2 variables, we see that most of the people say it's very unlikely that they're going to get a tick, and therefore it's very unlikely that they're going to get Lyme disease. But when we look at the answers about how likely, and the ones that respond that it's very likely that they're going to get a tick bite, they actually got a wider range of responses, and people we were seeing that there's a lower likelihood of getting Lyme disease. That's what they think. 65% of participants, they actually know someone who had Lyme disease, but it's usually not particularly close. 55% of the people claim that they have seen a tick before, but when we ask them about tick identification, showing them a plate, most of the people cannot identify the deer tick. So the next step regarding this is to try to build a knowledge score, and that's what we're working on. We have a preliminary knowledge score using item response theory to try to relate to the other variables like knowledge score and how that influence the use of protective measures. This can also influence activity patterns. And to measure human behavior, we're using a smartphone application where I've described this before, but we're trying to measure longitudinal data on what people do on a daily basis. And you can see it, read it in this paper. Using this information, for example, we explore the difference between the Midwest and the Northeast regarding human mobility. We overlap this with the use of, with the land cover classification to understand where people are, what's the frequency of using the different environments. We found in the Northeast is actually they're spending more time in forest that compared to the Midwest. And we found that previous tick exposure was actually associated with the proportion of time spent in forest, but not necessarily Lyme disease in the Northeast. And about tick use on Staten Island, we're still lagging behind a little bit on the number of users. That's why I'm not presenting any particular analysis on this. We are trying this year to offer economic incentives for people to use the app, so we also get not very biased sample. And then a third part of this research is to understand investment choices and willingness to pay. 33% of the households actually are using pesticides against ticks, mosquitoes, or any other insects. And health issues, when we asked them about why were the people that were not using it, they were mostly concerned about health issues. When we asked about organic, they actually, most of the people didn't have any concerns, but we know that organic pesticides are not really effective for ticks. And when we compare it to an area that is hyper-endemic, actually environmental issues were mostly reported. So this really, it's context dependent. And when we ask about willingness to pay for pesticides, most of the people, I would say almost 70% of the people were willing to pay up to $100 per year. When we ask about organic with that were equally effective, if hypothetically, this number increased a little bit, but also people were willing to pay more. But if we ask the same question about if they were being less effective, then people were actually decided in a higher proportion not to pay. When we ask about community level interventions, it's important to know that on Staten Island, there is a deer sterilization program going on. So we ask about deer sterilization and culling of deer. Actually, the sterilization had higher support, but the main concern was that it's not really effective. And so with all this information, what we're trying to do is to try to estimate Lyme disease risk by integrating all these building blocks. And we're trying to do that with a gene-based model where we model each person is an agent with different characteristics and different mobility patterns, activity patterns, and use of protective measures. And we let them move around the environment. I presented on this on the fall symposium, so I'm not going to go into many details, and you can find that in the YouTube channel for the Earth Institute. But basically, you can see people moving, and then we estimated that avoiding the park had the highest effect on the number of tick encounters. And so, as I mentioned, we want to try to integrate all this information from the ecological side of things and the activity and mobility patterns derived from the tick up and the KAPs. And also try to understand the human adaptive behaviors under different landscape configurations. So in that sense, I'm right now working on different landscape configurations, so modifying the preliminary agent-based model to address different type of landscapes, basically trying to see how the density of green spaces and how aggregated they are, which is the percolation probability, affect this tick encounter measures. So you can see here, for example, a landscape that has 70% habitat density and a percolation probability of 0.45. And here is when a 10% suitable habitat density. This is still ongoing, so I'm a little bit over time, so I'm not going to go into many more details. But I wanted to thank everybody for listening to this talk. And if you want to have more information, read more information about this project, you can go to the website that I have there. Thank you very much.
Pilar, I have a question for you.
Yes.
You've been working on this project for a while with us, and I've seen a lot of different conclusions that you've come out with. What are some of the most interesting things that you found as a result of this research?
So one of the things that I think it's very interesting that we're seeing is that the dynamics so Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases have been studied mostly on very suburban areas where you have houses that are in the middle, embedded in the woods. And this is a very different situation when we're talking about more urban areas. And what we have been seeing is that within endemic areas, like endemic regions like the Northeast, there is an advance of tick-borne diseases in more urban parks. And this dynamics is completely different. And I think one of the most interesting things that we found is that people have very different risk perceptions, and they behave very differently from what they would do in a hyperendemic area where they have been dealing with tick-borne diseases for a long time. And so we really need to address and think about the interventions that would be adapted to this context. And that's basically when we study this disease as socio-ecological systems, is that we don't only have to take into account how the ecological context of things, but also how people interact with it, which is very, very different from other areas.
Great, thank you. John, do you have a question? And then we have a question from Megan Maurer, who's on the Zoom call.
Yeah, so why don't you go to Megan?
Okay, Megan, go ahead. You said you had a question.
Okay, yeah. So I'll preface this, Pilar knows this, but for those of you who don't, I study green space and well-being. And so I had a question for you about the relationship between knowledge and risk perception. And with the question of, have you looked at the relationship between knowledge and risk perception over a continuum? Because what I'm wondering, is there a scenario where people get a little bit of knowledge and their response is then to just completely avoid the park, versus people who get more knowledge and know sort of more strategically how to prevent tick-borne illness, and then they go back to using the park, but they go back to using the park with appropriate protection measures? Because I'm interested, we don't want a scenario where people are like, oh no, Lyme disease, so they stop going outside into parks and green spaces because there's be a cascade of other negative health effects long-term from avoiding parks completely. And so is there a place where knowledge and risk perception can sort of align to make people use their green spaces in a safe way rather than just like avoiding altogether?
Yeah, so in preliminary analysis, and we're working on the integrating all the questions. So from the KAP survey, we collect a lot of data on their knowledge. We ask a lot of questions, and we're trying to use that information to build the knowledge score so we can relate it to risk perception and the use of protective measures and see how everything comes together. But yes, in simple analysis, we've seen that the people that have more knowledge, they're using more protective measures and they are going outdoors more often and they're not avoiding green spaces. So it's definitely something that it's a little bit intuitive, but on the other spectrum, as they have a lot more information, so for example, in hyperendemic areas where they know that they have the risk perception is high, they know that there are ticks, but they're surrounded by them. And so people actually, and they have a lot of knowledge about the disease and ticks and how to protect themselves, but surprisingly, they use less protective measures, which is, you can go to an extreme where it's like, well, I'm gonna get it anyways, so why I'm gonna invest in this?
Do you have,
Thanks, Pilar.
is there any signal in age, race, and gender in how people respond?
So definitely in age, we particularly when where we get our data from, which is Staten Island, it's not, well, it is diverse in the sense that if you take the whole Staten Island, there are different demographic groups, but they're very segregated within the island. So for example, most of the African American community and the Latino community live in the north part of the island, which is it's more urban and they don't have a lot of green spaces. And so that kind of doesn't really allow us to get to this information.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But there's something really interesting is, and I think, well, there's a few interesting things that we're going to do this summer, depending on the context and everything that is happening. But we want to better understand how COVID-19 is going to affect human behavior this year. And so, for example, it's people from the north that are not really used to know about ticks are going to go to the parks in the mid part of the island and the south part of the island and get exposed to ticks, and they will have that less experience and knowledge about ticks because they're not used to it. So that would be an interesting thing to explore this year. And the same with the landscapers and gardeners, because usually it's a certain demographic group that does those jobs, and we haven't really explored that.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So I don't see any other questions for
I have a
Pilar.
question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I have a
Go ahead,
question.
Lisa.
So Pilar, that was a great presentation. I was just wondering what kind of challenges you had during field work, because I know it wasn't probably easy to go to people's house and go to get samples in their yards. So what kind of challenges did you encounter?
Well, when you do household surveys, you always have the challenge of how it's people going to react. We have been really lucky that the fact that, so we go through the day and we visit the different houses. The main challenge is that people are working during the day. So we have expanded our hours of operation and trying to, for this year, well, I don't know if it's going to happen, but work on weekends as well. But the main, and usually, so half of the houses are closed, and so that kind of complicates a little bit of our study design. But from those that open the door and when we present ourselves and explain the study, most of them agree to participate. So I would say that participation rates are high for an urban area. And then we have been really lucky. We haven't had a lot of challenges or people reacting unexpectedly, but it's always a challenge, and you'll have to prepare for the questions that people might have and how they're going to react to what you tell them.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you both. So I think we'll move on now in the interest of time to Lisa's presentation. Lisa is going to be discussing who and where are the most food insecure houses in Senegal. So give me a moment as I pull this up and we'll get started and take questions afterwards. Thanks, Pilar.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for attending this symposium. The research that I'm about to present is based on preliminary analysis of food security that I'm conducting with Alessandra Giannini, my mentor at the IRI, as part of my EI postdoc. In this presentation, I will be talking about the characteristics of least food secure households in Senegal. When talking about food security, there are multiple dimensions to consider. But for the sake of time, I will mainly focus on who these households are using a cluster analysis and where they are located at using maps. In the cluster analysis, I will be looking at their food consumption, the climate sensitivity of their main source of income, their vulnerability to shocks. And I will use maps to show their geographic location within the country. Senegal is a country located in the Sahel region of West Africa. The country covers an area of 197,000 square kilometers with more than 16 million people. 47% of its population lives below the poverty line, with challenges in meeting basic food, health, and education needs. Senegal is known in the region as one of the most stable and democratic countries. In 2019, the country ranked 67 out of 117 on the Global Hunger Index. Rural households relying on rain-fed agriculture for their subsistence are particularly vulnerable to droughts, insufficient food production, land degradation, food price hikes, and they have lower resilience. In the lean season of 2019, for instance, 342,000 people were severely food insecure. All these challenges make Senegal one of the countries with the highest rates of international migration. We use time series World Food Programme data from different years and seasons. In this presentation, I will mainly focus on the data from January 2016. In the Sahel, January corresponds to the end of harvest, and it's a time when food is still available. A total of 4,008 rural households were interviewed, and these are the households we focus on for our analysis. Our approach consisted of combining food consumption score with reduced coping strategy index and percentage of food expenditure to comprehensively assess food security, which involves dimensions such as availability, access, and consumption, among others. The food consumption score looks at the frequency and diversity of food consumed in the past 7 days. The percentage of food expenditure is the percent of cash spent on food from total household expenditure. The reduced coping strategy index is the sum of all coping strategies scores. We use a cluster analysis to define food security and to find the characteristics of least food secure households. Our analysis divides households into different groups based on the 3 variables that I just mentioned: the food consumption score, the percentage of food expenditure, and the reduced coping strategy index. This table shows the different clusters in this study, along with the total number of households within each cluster. Households within each cluster display similar behaviors. And the values you see here are the average values of the 3 variables considered for each cluster. In our study, every household is a unique point that links all 3 variables. These below are 2-dimension plots of the clusters using 2 variables at a time. For example, this plot looks at food consumption score and food expenditure, and this one looks at food consumption score and reduced coping strategy index. I will explain these two plots and focus more on them in the next part of my presentation that looks at food consumption. Here, each household is a dot in the space defined by each of these variables, and each color is a different cluster. For instance, green and blue correspond to the most food secure households, and red, yellow, and orange correspond to the least food secure households. So we found that least food secure households had a low food consumption score. They had a low food consumption score. They spent more on food compared to most food secure households, and they used a higher number of coping strategies. Here in this column that represent most food secure households, the most food secure households, you can definitely see that they spend less on food, which could mean that they rely mainly on their own production. And they used less coping strategies. The least food secure households also derived most of their income from climate sensitive activities, mainly agriculture, pastoralism, and fisheries. They were also most vulnerable to shocks, and the most significant shocks were economic, such as increased food prices. Environmental shocks were less significant compared to economic shocks in January 2016. But it is different depending on the year, the rainfall patterns of a specific year. Because when we looked at data from 2014, we found that environment shocks, many households complain about environment shocks such as insufficient rains. So where are the least food secure households located at? Most least food secure these maps show the percentage of households that are most food secure here and least food secure within each department. Overall, there are much more food secure households in January in the country. And the most food secure households tend to be located in the central part of the country as well as in the north. And the least food secure households tend to be located in the eastern part of the country around the Tambacounda area. But something interesting is that even most food secure households are also found in the Tambacounda region. So there seems to be an overlap. And this is something that we are eager to learn during field work. As a conclusion, we found that less food secure households have low food consumption score. They use the highest number of coping strategies and they spend more on food. They also derive more income from climate sensitive activities, and they were most impacted by shocks, and economic shocks were the most significant ones, as I was mentioning, but this depends from year to year and season to season. Most of these households were located in the eastern part of the country, and seasonality is something that I want to stress because our findings vary depending on the season and rainfall patterns on a specific year. So it is important to also look at other seasons and years for a more complete picture. So what's next and why is this study relevant? Next, we are going to conduct field work to better understand our results within the Senegalese context. And this work will contribute in helping advance the work of national and international development agencies such as WFP, FAO, FuseNet, working to eradicate hunger in Senegal and in the Sahel region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a great presentation. We'll take questions now from, I don't know if John, you have a question or any of the other panelists. If not, I have a question that I can ask.
Yeah, I was wondering if people have relatively easy access to fish and seafood, obviously that's not going to be harmed by a drought. So does that tend to make people more food secure, or is that not important?
So for people located near coastal areas, yes, they would have better access to fish compared to other people who are located in landlocked regions. So definitely, if you have access to fish, in addition to cereals and even meat, you would tend to be more food secure. But the number of people who can have access to fish also is like not too many people can have access to fish, because you need to buy fish if you're not from a family that has fishermen. So there are many parameters, so transportation, access to coastal areas, and even income. So depending on your income, some people will have better access compared to others. So
Yeah, thanks.
mm-hmm.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Yes.
Hey, thank you so much for your presentation. I found that really interesting. I was wondering more broadly in the domestic context in Senegal, whether the problem gets framed as more of an ecological environmental issue versus like a socio inequity issue, and also what's being done about it within the domestic context, and also if there are like international movements that are having an influence, like just transition or like a broader movement of sorts.
Thank you for your question. So before I answer, I want to point out that like this is the first time I'm conducting like work in Senegal. My field site used to be Burkina Faso, so I'm much more familiar with Burkina. But for the case of Senegal, I don't know if there are any social movements. I just know that there is this movement against like food price hikes, but that was like more like a West African thing. But I would like to, like, I prefer going to the field first before I actually answer your question, and I will be very happy to follow up on that. So most of the findings we have the analysis, but now we will be going to the field so I can make sure I have a better answer for you.
Cool, thank you.
Great, thank you both. I don't see any other questions on the chat. So if there are no other questions, we'll move on to the next presentation, which is Megan Maurer. And bear with me as I get the video started. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was a great presentation.
Thank you, Sam.
Hi, I'm Megan Maurer, and today I'm going to be talking about experiencing nature and happiness in Washington Square Park. Before I begin, though, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Lisa Zaval, at the Center for Research on Environmental Decisions, and the co-PIs on this project, Dr. Patricia Culligan and Dr. Ben Orloff. Together, we are all part of an NSF-funded sustainability research network on integrated urban infrastructure solutions for healthy cities. We are interested in how new scales and techniques of infrastructure design, particularly distributed green infrastructure, can contribute to urban health, sustainability, and livability. And we are interested in those questions because of climate change. In New York, climate change is projected to have several interacting impacts, particularly rising sea levels, increased flood risk from rainfall events and hurricane activity, and increased heat island effects and heat waves. Vegetation is believed to help with all of these problems. Plants can be used to create wetlands and soft edges to help manage the effects of sea level rise, while in vegetating within a city increases the amount of permeable surface area, because plants don't grow in concrete, they go in soil, and this can help absorb stormwater. Plants also help reduce heat island effects and the intensity of heat waves by decreasing the amount of paved surface in the city, and also through transpiration, and in the case of trees, shading effects. So green infrastructure in New York City and in cities around the world is being seen as an important tool for climate change adaptation and resilience. In addition to all these environmental benefits, green infrastructure is also believed to come with a number of co-benefits, including increases to health, stress reduction, and happiness. So from a policy and planning perspective, green infrastructure looks like a win-win. But the question is, does green infrastructure deliver? I have colleagues here at Columbia who are evaluating the performance of green infrastructure for stormwater management, but I'm particularly interested in the question of co-benefits. As the percentage of the world's population living in cities increases, so too does the need to understand how to promote quality of life among urban residents. Thus, my colleagues and I are interested in this question of how green space increases subjective well-being or happiness. That's the particular co-benefit that we're really focused on in this project, which is driven by two overarching questions. One, what is it about urban green space that improves well-being? Is it nature, or is nature just a part? What natural elements of the park are driving a connection to nature and happiness, and are these the same elements? To answer these questions, we conducted a field study in Washington Square Park. This park was selected for 4 reasons. First, compared with other parks in Manhattan, such as Central Park, it's a manageable size for the purposes of data collection. Second, the park offers a variety of design elements, from green vegetation to walkways to areas to socialize. Third, unlike other smaller parks in Manhattan that are designed as social spaces with some landscaping, Washington Square Park combines both natural and social design elements, including trees and grass. Fourth, there are a wide variety of activities taking place in the park and provides a nice cross-section of the kinds of things that New Yorkers get up to in their city parks. Once we nailed down the location, we set out with the goal of identifying as narrowly as possible what it was about the park that was increasing users' happiness and connectedness to nature. We wanted to look at discrete elements of the park, and we were prepared to go down to the species level with plants. And so we designed a 3-part mixed method study using observational, quantitative, and qualitative data collection. For each participant, we collected demographics, completed the observational component of the instrument, and asked why they had come to the park that day. Then research assistants asked either a qualitative or a quantitative set of questions. And so I'm just going to review these 3 different sections of the survey real fast before going into our results. For the observational component, we recorded the weather, cloud cover, and temperature, as well as each participant's activity and location in the park. And location, the park was divided into 6 different areas based on landscape and activity, and that was how we determined location. The qualitative interview asked 2 simple open-ended questions. 1, when you think about your experience in Washington Square Park today, which parts of this experience make you happy? 2, can you tell me which natural elements of Washington Square Park make you feel most connected to nature, and can you tell me about that connection? For the quantitative survey, participants were asked to evaluate 11 park elements on 2 dimensions. 1, the degree to which the element impacted feelings of happiness, and 2, the degree to which the element impacted feelings of connectedness to nature. And the instrument looked like this. So this grid was for happiness, and then either at the top of the page or the bottom of the page, we alternated which respondents saw first. There was another grid that asked them to rate connectedness to nature. These instruments were administered by a pair of RAs between June and August of 2019, between 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. We had 105 total participants. 54 took the quant survey, 51 were given the qual interview. In terms of demographics, our sample skewed male. Our median age was spot on. Our income skewed low. We think this is because our young people were NYU students and not up-and-coming investment bankers. Our sample also skewed white and underrepresented Latino residents. And now taking a look at our quantitative results, we looked at the mean ratings for happiness and connectedness to nature for all 11 elements. We found ceiling effects for both dimensions, and the range of judgments for the 2 dimensions was small. In other words, everything was making people happy and everything was making people connected to nature. So we looked at the relationship between these two. And we found a significant positive correlation between happiness and connectedness to nature. The same things that were making people happy were the same things that were making people connected to nature. And since everything was making people happy and everything was making people connected to nature, we couldn't say anything about what it was about the park in terms of specific elements that were driving these increases in well-being and connectedness to nature. It was just everything. And this would have been a disappointment if this was all our study was. However, we had a whole set of qualitative interviews to look at, and we're able to use those results to add more nuance to our quantitative findings. And so that's what I'm going to go into next. We looked in our qualitative results at the relationship between subjective well-being and connectedness to nature and found a much more nuanced picture. Only 20% of our interview respondents named exclusively natural elements as making them happy. 51% named some combination of natural or social and non-natural elements, meaning that 80% of our respondents, some kind of social or non-natural element was a contributor to happiness. So while connectedness to nature does play an important role in experiences of happiness, for the majority of respondents, subjective well-being resulted from a more multifaceted experience. We didn't ask about social elements on the quantitative survey, and it turns out that they're a really important contributor to happiness. Next, we tried to think about what specific elements of the park were contributing to happiness in terms of what people were telling us in the qualitative interviews. And here at first, again, we found that nothing stood out. A couple people named this element, a couple people named that element, whether it was natural or non-natural. It was just a few people for this element, just a few people for that element, with the exception of trees, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So we tried folding these elements up into higher order categories, and this didn't really work either because our categories ended up being really abstract and said more about the kind of experience that people were having in the park than what it was about the park they were responding to. And so we shifted focus and we said, what if it isn't about the specific things in the park? What if it is about the kind of experience that you are able to have in the park? And so that's when we ended up sort of reanalyzing our qualitative results and finding that the experience of happiness resulted from what we call a holistic para-urban experience, because the elements, the social and the natural elements that people were drawing on to create an experience of happiness were highly varied, and they were very idiosyncratic, very individually specific. But what was being shared across respondents was a kind of experience. And this was an experience of the park as a space set apart from the surrounding city and a space of proximity to a set of elements construed as different from those that comprise the city at large. While not completely separate from the surrounding city, the park was understood by users as a space that existed alongside of, but distinct from the urban milieu around it. It was para-urban. And in terming this experience of the para-urban holistic, we're referring to the fact that park users seldom singled out a relationship to specific elements, but rather referred to their experience as a whole or interactions among multiple elements. And the way that we coded for this in our results was by looking at the number of references to a boundary, whether this was a boundary, a sense of boundary in terms of being within something, the park, or something being outside the city. And we had 55% of the sample were referencing a boundary in some way. 23% were referencing a boundary in terms of being within it, and 39% were referencing a boundary in terms of there being something without. We also looked at the occurrence of conjoint listing of natural and social or non-natural elements, or the naming of some kind of interaction between the two, and that was about a third of our respondents. So what about trees? Because I said I was going to come back to it, and I will. A quarter of our respondents did name trees as a contributor to happiness. This is the single most prominent element. And 2/3 named it in terms of a connection to nature. And while most respondents simply mentioned trees, more elaborate responses included references to shade, a sense of being immersed or covered, a connection to the past, or a feeling of rooted or groundedness. And so we started to think, based on that, we started to think that the contribution of trees to feelings of connection to nature and increased happiness resulted not only from the presence of trees, but their interaction with other park elements, such as sun, lawns, sky, and benches. So while trees were the thing that got named a lot, it wasn't just the trees necessarily. The exact social and or natural components of the park, as well as the mental or inner state involved, vary from person to person in their presence, absence, and configuration. What is widely shared, however, is the kind of experience of the sense of the park as a place apart from the city, where different kinds of observations and interactions with natural and social elements can and do occur. A particular interest is the ways individual people construct experiences of happiness in Washington Square Park out of diverse natural, social, and or non-natural elements. Our second key finding is that trees matter. While a combination of natural and social elements and their interactive effects appear to generate the greatest levels of happiness for park users, trees stand out as a single natural element. We believe that there are two reasons for this. Trees are frequently mentioned in connection with shading and canopy coverage. While important for temperature regulation, these attributes of trees also contribute a sense of the park as a place apart. Trees, particularly their branching and leaves, help create for park users the experience of being out of the city. This is supported by the references of respondents to the physical experience of proximity to trees, being under trees, the number of people sitting in tree-covered sections of the park, etc. Relatedly, trees play an important signaling role for the park as a different kind of space. Trees signal to park users that the space is different from the surrounding urban environment and provide a sense of connection to the natural world. This is supported by the linking of trees with the para-urban as an example of how the park is not like the city, and indeed 41% of our boundary references included a mention of trees. So what do these findings mean? They indicate that co-benefits of green infrastructure, particularly happiness, are related to the size of the infrastructure. Feelings of being in or surrounded by the green space were key components of happiness for the majority of respondents. This would suggest that larger scale green infrastructure, such as parks, are preferable for the delivery of co-benefits when compared to smaller distributed forms of infrastructure like bioswales. Numerous kinds of intermediately sized green infrastructures can be found in cities, however, such as pocket parks and green streets, and further research is therefore required to better understand at what scale green infrastructure can deliver increased subjective well-being. The strong preference for trees as both a way to connect to nature and a source of increased happiness offers clear implications for green infrastructure and urban landscape design. Our results suggest that landscape architects and urban designers should incorporate trees into designs whenever possible. Moreover, their apparent role as a boundary signaling feature indicates that trees may be of particular importance for establishing a perimeter around green spaces and facilitating the experience of these locations as places distinct from the surrounding urban landscape. And with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. We have a question on the chat from Robbie Parks. He writes, great talk, Megan. Did you look at effect modification of responses by time of day, night, or season?
Sorry.
No worries.
So what was that? That was time of day, season, and what was the other factor?
Did you look at effect modification of responses by time of day, in parentheses, day/night or
Okay.
season.
Okay. So we limited our time of day to sort of the lunch hour. And there were two reasons for this. One is what in terms of like the temporal spread, we were not going to have RAs in the park at night. Just a safety issue. I did not feel comfortable having RAs in the park after dark, which would be a really useful thing to know what's happening in the park then, but it wasn't going to work. And today we were focusing on the lunch hour because we wanted to get the highest proportion of respondents. We wanted to get respondents who lived in New York. And so we weeded out everybody who was a tourist. We just didn't, that was our first, like, it wasn't even an instrument question, right? It was just like, are you a New York City resident? Okay, you can take our survey. If you're not, then you're weeded out. And in order to do that, we focused really on the lunch hour because that's when the most sort of anecdotally from experience and observation, that's when the most sort of local users are using the park. They're using it as a lunch break kind of situation. In terms of season, no, we just surveyed during the summer, but I do have a student who is doing did some surveying of parks over the winter to see if seasonality did have an effect. So stay tuned for those results.
Okay, great. Robbie had a follow-up saying everything was positive, but I can imagine how there might be negative perceptions of, say, high walls and trees is scary at night. So he meant what people think of parks of at night.
Right. I think that's really important. And there are a range of studies that show safety concerns in terms of foliage. But actually most of those have shown that it's a real lines of sight thing. And so it's the mid canopy, it's the sort of low canopy, like shrub level layer that creates the most sort of feelings of insecurity. Trees, as long as they're not sort of like, right up next to each other, that you have space between them, actually allow for more lines of sight than sort of low-lying, well, not low-lying, but sort of that mid-level vegetation is the one that's most associated with risk concern. I think doing a survey like this at night would be a really great thing to do. I think you need to be very intentional about the RAs that you're hiring and sort of the process by which you're sending them out there. I just, it does increase the risk. And I think you need to be thoughtful about how you go about doing that study, which was just not something we were prepared to do this time around.
Great, thank you. So we have two more questions on the chat. Liv Yoon says, in the work that you're doing in Gowanus right now, are there differences you've been noticing? And how do you think results would differ in lower SES areas?
Yeah, I don't have a really perfect comparison because my work in Gowanus has not been focused on parks, but on street trees and bioswales, which are smaller, more distributed kinds of infrastructure. So my answer is very much a like sort of anecdotal like sense of things. And not a great, like I said, it's not a great comparison. Though to be honest, I think that there haven't been a huge amount of, I don't think I can do a comparison there because the infrastructures are so different that I've been looking at. I haven't been looking at parks in Gowanus, so I don't think I can answer that. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. So one more question. Oh, go ahead, John.
Oh, I was just wondering if there was sort of an endogeneity issue here. I mean, if people are in a park, they like being in a park. So you've got a subset of everybody in the first place. Did you ever think of, and you can choose to go to a park, it's not like you have to go there to eat. So there's an element of, surely there's an element of endogeneity. You don't have a, excuse me, you don't have a counterfactual. You didn't talk to people who hate going to parks, if there are such people.
Yes. If there is a list of park haters anonymous or something, I'd love to send my survey to them. Actually, we did. well, I didn't, Lisa did. So before I joined this project, my co-author, Dr. Lisa Zabal, who is a behavioral psychologist, actually ran an experiment where their field sites were Washington Square Park and 1221 Plaza on the Avenue of the Americas, which is a very dense urban brown space. And she was trying to run an experiment to address your concern, John, about is it, you know, I mean, it doesn't fully address your concern, but trying to sort of, because one of the things is people in the parks are happier than people outside of the parks, but maybe that's just because people who choose to go to the parks are happier people. And it's really hard to answer that question, but by running that experiment, she was trying to narrow down at least like what it was about the park versus the brown space. Did the greenery have anything to do with that? That's what I'm trying to get at, right? She was trying to figure out, did the greenery have anything to do with that perceived difference, by trying to control for that factor. And it did, which is why in the second round, we just went to the park. We just set the brown space aside and we just looked at the park because we were like, okay, we've established that there's something about this greenery that's having an impact because we have a lunch crowd in dense Manhattan neighborhoods, controlled for a lot of other factors, and like it was the greenery that was driving differences in well-being between those two populations. And so we went back and we're trying to understand specifically what about the greenery is contributing to that. So I don't think that fully addresses your concern, but we're trying to find ways to get at that. Yeah, we're trying, and it's not perfect, but it's a really good concern. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we have one more question on the chat and then we need to move on in the interest of time. Pretty Suthakar says, interesting work. Did you find any differentiation in the boundaries as soft or hard boundaries and how users viewed this transition into a different kind of space?
Whether they perceived it as a soft boundary or a hard boundary. I don't think we had the depth of data to answer that. Most of our interview responses were 2 to 15 minutes. And we weren't prompting or asking about boundary at all. We weren't prompting at all. We were just like, we asked the question and just let people answer. And we're just like zero prompting from our RAs. So we didn't actually ask anything specifically about the boundary or the quality of the boundary. And I just don't think in people's responses, we have a rich enough data to answer that question, but it's a really great question for a follow-up.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Megan. So we're going to move on to our last presentation, Liv Yoon, Envisioning Alternative Socioeconomic Futures. And I'll pull up the video and then we will take questions at the end and then have questions for the rest of the presenters. I know there's a question or two in the chat for earlier presenters, so we'll move back to there. So bear with me as I pull up the video.
Hi, my name is Liv Yoon, and I am one of the 2019 to 21 cohort of postdocs, and I'm working with Dr. Diana Hernandez at the Mailman School of Public Health. My research interests lie largely at the intersection of climate change and social inequality, and my project is entitled Envisioning Alternative Socio-Environmental Futures, Communities in Just Transition. I'm here to talk about what I originally planned to do, but I'm rethinking because of the new limitations imposed by the pandemic, and I would love to get your feedback and suggestions on what I am thinking as an alternative, as well as just my project itself. So thank you for this opportunity to think this through with the inter and multidisciplinary colleagues here at the Earth Institute. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Lenape peoples past and present. The name Manhattan derives from the Lenape word for island, Manatee. We should honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout generations. Here's a preview of my presentation. I'll first talk about the broader context and motivation for this project. I'll then give some details about what I both have and had in mind pre-COVID-19 and what I'm considering as contingency plans. And then I'll float by you my concerns and questions right now, and I'd love to get your insight and suggestions as I'm unsure how to carry forward. You're of course more than welcome to comment on any other aspect of my project or presentation as well. So I'll start with this quote that was the opening line to my EI postdoc application and also captures what it is that I'm trying to do. To be truly radical is to make hope possible, not despair convincing. And one way to make hope possible is by showing alternative futures that are already in the making. And just transition is one way to get to one of these alternative futures. Just transition is a roadmap to a cleaner, more sustainable, and equitable future by transitioning away from an extractive economy to a clean and regenerative economy. I'll say more about this in a bit. But what I propose to do in a nutshell is to explore lived experiences of communities undergoing just transition and make a documentary about it for knowledge translation and mobilization efforts. Having this type of knowledge translation product is important because the aim here is to make these cases more visible and accessible, especially as we mostly only have theoretical literature on this topic and not many concrete examples to look to. The underlying motivation is that there's a need for more hopeful narratives around climate change and climate justice, but hope that is substantive, that we can point to be able to say, hey, this is indeed possible, and it's already happening. And I believe that this is timely and important, especially considering the urgency to act, and to challenge the overwhelming sense of doom and gloom and resignation that many people feel about climate change. Okay, so how did I come to this project? Oops. As you all know, the 2018 IPCC report warned that we have 12 years then and now less than 10 years to limit catastrophic climate change, so we need to act. And borrowing from Naomi Klein, while resistance and saying no are important, that's not enough, especially when we have so little time. Instead, we need a credible and inspiring yes to fight for. And to take action, having hope and a concrete vision of what we're fighting for is instrumental. So not just having something to fight against, to say no to, but to have something to strive towards is important. Also, because many naysayers say that transitioning away from dirty energy is impossible and too costly, having concrete examples to counter this narrative is crucial. The good news is transitions are already happening around the world, and there's a lot to learn from these lived experiences. But talking about this shouldn't be just limited to academia, which is why knowledge translation and mobilization efforts here are so important, and is the main reason I want to make a documentary about it. And on that note, this seems like a great time and a place to be doing this type of work, especially as scholars studying climate change, natural science, and social science scholars alike, are putting more effort into knowledge translation. So organizations like the Initiative and the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability here, headed by Andrew Revkin at the Earth Institute, is a good example of people paying attention to why it matters how we communicate about this stuff. And with that background, I'll describe more in detail what I have or perhaps had in mind for my project. Just transition is a principle, a process, and a practice to build economic and political power to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. The concept was first forged by labor unions and environmental justice groups, especially those rooted in low-income communities of color who saw the need to phase out industries that were harming workers, community health, and the planet, and wanted to provide just pathways for workers to transition to other jobs. It's important to note that just transition isn't just about jobs, though. Instead, the whole point of this roadmap is that it should be holistic, and that this transition related to energy and climate change can be leveraged as an opportunity to reassess and mobilize on a lot of different social, cultural, and political fronts to create positive social change. For example, climate justice groups and others, like those behind the Green New Deal, have taken this up to represent a host of strategies to transition whole communities to build thriving economies that provide dignified, productive, and ecologically sustainable livelihoods and democratic governance and resilience. I wanted to find out more and directly learn from these communities that were adopting this approach. And the two that I found are Tonawanda, New York, and Parkland County in Alberta, Canada. Before I say more about each place, I'll first talk about why it's important to talk to these folks and learn directly from them. It's important to talk to these folks and learn directly from them because that's the only way we'll learn more about what the transition process actually looked like on the ground level. And the process matters here, particularly in just transition, because if the process of the transition is not just, the outcome will never be. Amartya Sen's distinction between culmination outcomes, so what things you end up with, versus comprehensive outcomes, what things you end up with, plus the way in which you get there, is relevant here. In other words, just transition describes both where we're going and how we should get there. So it's both a goal and a process, and learning more about the way there is crucial, and that's possible only through talking to direct stakeholders rather than just looking at end results. And to ensure that the way there is equitable, the communities must have a say. Better yet, they should be the ones leading it bottom up, especially because just transition seeks to address multiple intersecting axes of inequity. The interwoven nuance of the nitty-gritty can only be captured through conversation and observation. And as I said earlier, just transition is a moment of opportunity to seize the remaking of energy infrastructures, to also reshape the power infrastructures and social relations of our lives. And being on site and talking to people would be the best way to get at this multifaceted nature of just transition, and to add to literature that is mostly theoretical to date. And here are some more details about the communities that I have been talking to. First, Tonawanda, New York, is a small city of about 15,000 people at the northern edge of Erie County near Buffalo. It used to depend on the Huntley coal fire station, which closed in 2016, and Tonawanda Coke, which closed in October of 2018. These plants were the area's largest air and water polluters, but also the biggest taxpayers. So when they closed, the consequences were huge due to the loss in tax revenue, which led to things like teachers losing their jobs and schools closing. And all of this was in addition to those who used to work at the plants who also lost their jobs. And there was a community-wide response led by the Huntley Alliance, which is made up of the Clean Air Coalition of New York, Western New York, which had already been fighting air and water pollution related to the coal plants. Labor unions like the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, AFL-CIO, and other community groups like teachers associations and the local chapter of the Sierra Club. They successfully advocated for the state of New York to give temporary assistance to reinvent its tax base. And this was the first time a state had offered to financially cushion a community undergoing just transition. And they're currently in their 4th year of state funding of 7 years. So they're about midway, and I'm in touch with folks at the Clean Air Coalition. And they said that they are at a point of assessing where are we at, and they also said that people are feeling a lack of vision, so something like a documentary would be a good way to reinvigorate those involved. The other community is Parkland County in Alberta, Canada. Alberta is home to Canada's highest concentration of coal and oil-based economies. And Parkland County is a district just outside of Edmonton, which is the capital city of Alberta, and Parkland County has about 30,000 residents. It's part rural and part urban, and in 2015, half of the 18 coal-fired plants in the province were here. It's in the middle of a rapid phase-out of coal-fired electricity province-wide, and with a goal, there's a goal of a complete phase-out by the end of 2029. Some have already closed, which has drastically reduced their tax revenue, and the estimate is that about 1,000 people will lose their jobs with the plant shutdowns. And they're getting help from both the provincial and federal levels, most of which is going to infrastructure projects and attracting private investment and jobs. So my original plan was to go to these two communities and live in each a bit this summer and get to know the people there, learn more about the local context, and then film interviews in relevant sites, etc. on the ground. And I would be using the participatory documentary process method, which would mean that community members would determine the narrative and would be involved as producers and not just as subjects to be featured. And since there's a big emphasis on ensuring that the communities have an active voice in the transition itself, it's also fitting to have the communication about this process be driven by them. So in other words, they would determine the storyline and the narrative of the film. And folks I've been in touch with have shown an active interest in this idea, and they saw the documentary as conducive to reflect on their journey so far and to share information with other communities. But now, because of the pandemic, the documentary idea, at least for the summer, I think is out the window. I think. So on that note, here are some concerns and questions that I have right now that I would love your thoughts on. First, I have some concerns about how to configure hope in what I'm doing. I want to make sure that my use of hope doesn't come across as treacly or facile. Hope is certainly not a panacea, and I want to emphasize that hope exists in context. So for those on the front lines for whom survival is the #1 priority, the future they need to solve is today, and hope can feel like a luxury in that sense. So to those folks, I'm wary that centering hope could come across as flippant, especially coming from someone like me who's not a direct stakeholder. At the same time, I do see a lot of value in emphasizing substantive hope, and I want to acknowledge that positive and negative emotions about climate change and its repercussions don't have to be mutually exclusive. As Swedish psychologist Maria Ohala said, it's an and instead of an or situation, and I think there's value in focusing on the and holding both positive and negative emotions. On that note, I went to the new climate story last month that featured Dr. Kate Marvel as the moderator, and Mary-Anais Hegler, and journalists Catherine Wilkinson and Kendra Pierre-Lewis about how scientists, and artists, and educators and journalists can shape news stories and conversations that help forge a creative and productive path toward a better future. And something that stuck with me was the ending. So usually these talks end with the moderator asking panelists, what gives you hope? But instead, Dr. Kate Marvel, who had written about hope before, asked, what makes you feel? Which really resonated with me. And it made me think, especially in light of research that suggests that affect is vital in mobilization related to climate change and climate justice, that in the end, my goal is to create something that makes people feel, whether that be hope or anger or resilience or what have you, whatever it takes to mobilize and act. So yeah, my question is how to create something that makes people feel, and what are the questions that I should be asking? And here are some more immediate logistical concerns. First of all, fieldwork this summer is no longer a go. And with no end to this pandemic clearly in sight, I'm wondering if my documentary idea is just out the window. And in that case, is my next best option to do video interviews and to just go with more traditional outputs like journal articles, which would of course be helpful for my academic career anyway, and I should probably do this anyway. But that doesn't exactly align with the goals that I set out with. And the remaining questions here apply to both the documentary format or the more traditional route that I might go. So how to document their story without only documenting hardship, or in other words, how to document hardship without compromising the narrative of hope. Next, how to document success that hasn't materialized yet. This is an important question to ask because just transition is a long-term game with ebbs and flows, and many of these transitions are in their nascent planning phase. So people are still devising strategies and are far from the implementation phase. So I'm wondering if I'm doing this project maybe a couple of years too early, maybe. And next, what to do with conflicting visions of success. For example, some may consider the transition from coal to natural gas a form of success, while others may not, since it's yet another extractive form of energy. So should these be considered examples of incremental success, or should the focus be more on structural and comprehensive change? Lastly, I'm wondering if it's an issue that Tonawanda, New York doesn't fit the typical mold of coal country. By this, what I mean is that Tonawanda, by being in a state like New York, that is both financially able and politically willing to support them, has it much easier than places like Kentucky, where there is neither the financial nor political support. So, is it a disservice to talk about just transition without documenting Appalachia, where circumstances are much more difficult? So that wraps it up for me for my presentation. But before I go, I would like to give some shout outs to some people. First, to my brilliant roommate and great self-isolation partner, Liv Yoon, for her time and insight on this presentation specifically, but also thinking through this with me since September. And Marianne Hegler and her Climate Reading Series group, and Aditi Bansal for the helpful resources, and my mentor, Dr. Diana Hernandez, for always supporting me. And a big thanks to all of you for tuning in and listening. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Liv. That was great. So we'll take some questions now. I don't see any in the chat box right away. If any of the panelists or John want to jump in, please feel free.
Yeah, so thanks for the presentation. I learned a tremendous amount. And so just a practical question. I mean, how late is too late to get started on a true documentary? Is the end of the summer too late, or how?
Yeah, go ahead, sorry. Sorry, finish your question, I interrupted you.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're asking in part whether it's too late to really start doing a documentary, but how late is too late? What if this is all over by the end of the summer? Is that too late?
No, I think if it was over by the end of the summer, that would be an ideal case scenario. Because the filming itself would only take about a week in each location. But
Yeah.
Ideally, I wanted to be in each town and live there for at least a month before to build up rapport and to get to know the community and like better learn the context, rather than just as a researcher just parachuting in and doing my thing and getting out. So I think, my postdoc will end in August of 2021. So even next spring, I think it also depends on what I do in the interim. So like this summer, I'm planning on having some video interviews with some people so I can do some of the learning the context work.
Sure. Yeah, and how much, you mentioned this, the choice of locations is a little bit serendipitous and a little bit, why those two places, how do you think you're going to get around that sort of basic, why a place in Canada and a place in northern New York?
Yeah. So the main reason behind each location, first of all, was that I was looking for places where just transition processes were actively happening. So I was looking for cases of success because there's a lot of documentation of people trying and not getting anywhere, especially similar, or like Kentucky, for example. So that already limited my options to a lot. And that is the main reason. And Tonawanda came up as one of the very, very few examples where things are happening. There are, of course, cases in Germany. There are a lot of cases in Germany, but then there's the language barrier. So the combination of logistics and also my main motivator being that I wanted to document success.
So just briefly, people in that upper, forget the name of it, the northern New York City, who were put out of work as coal, etc. What are they doing? What are the alternate employment?
Yeah, so right now, I mean, since the two plants have closed in 2016 and 2018, a lot of them have moved to tourism industries. They've also expanded some like school, like education related programs. But this is the thing that my contact person at the Clean Air Coalition mentioned, that because they're in a state where, or they're in a place where the state supports them, they were able to have alternative options. They already didn't begin as a mono economy. There already were other options available, whereas cases like Appalachia, that's not the case, which is why I posed that question at the end. Does it make sense to talk about this if I'm not getting to places that actually have no other option?
Yeah, and education levels in Appalachia are much lower, and people who practically left high school to go work in the coal mines, they're not well trained. So an alternate job isn't as easy as it might be somewhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. So we have a question in the comments. This is from Daniel Eisencraft-Klein. Says, hi, Dr. Yoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was terrific. In terms of PDP, how do you balance your own knowledge of communication and how hard it is to do effective, i.e. catches public attention communication, with the importance of giving voice to community members and allowing them to determine approaches to communications?
Thank you for the question. So I'm just reading it. How do you balance your own knowledge of communication with the importance of giving voice to? I think hopefully like building rapport and having established a good relationship will matter a lot. That like I certainly don't want to impose my narrative on them, but also the people that I'm working with, I think it's clear that we kind of are aligned in our opinions. That said, I will also, of course, encounter people who don't. And yeah, I think it's, I need to be aware that this isn't just going to be a rosy process. Like it sounds good on paper to say, let the community drive the narrative, but I think it's going to be really messy in the interim. So I don't actually have a concrete answer for you, sorry, but that I think the one important thing is that to build a trustworthy relationship beforehand will matter a lot.
Okay, great. Then one more question from Beth Tellman. She writes, can you wait to do filming in the fall? Also, maybe if you can't live in the places, maybe you can partner with organizations working somewhere with a long history, such as Appalachia, but maybe they don't have the success you're looking for, from what I understand.
Yeah, I certainly get in touch with more people, and I mean, yeah, I have a lot of exploring to do in terms of contingency plans. Yeah, and yes, I will absolutely. I think waiting to do filming in the fall that's going to be the earliest possible anyway. So yeah, I see that totally as a possibility.
Great. So 2 more quick questions came in. So I think we have time to address those. Robbie Parks asked, do you have any general practical advice about how we can all be advocates for a just transition, which I think is a good question for all of us.
Oh man, only if I knew. I think it's actually important not to be, not to have tunnel vision. I mean, the whole point of just transition is that it doesn't have tunnel vision just to focus on energy transition. It's a holistic thing. So I think emphasizing that this isn't just about the form of energy, whether it's coal versus solar versus wind, but saying that this is actually a socio-political issue. Yeah, I think advocating for, I mean, the slogan is system change, not climate change, right? So I think emphasizing that point whenever we can, I think is important.
Great. And then the last question was from Sean Ford. What people hope for is often limited or shaped by what they know, what they've experienced. Could COVID-19 itself change what people know or how they are thinking about just transitions?
That is a great question that I don't have an answer to. I'm going to ask that question back at him. That's my friend, Sean. I certainly think this time will be a portal in a way to think about what is considered essential, what work is considered essential, what we value and why we value it. And yeah, what we think we know about essential practices in our lives and like consumption practices. So in hindsight, and hopefully this time will be in hindsight soon, if we can use this as a portal somehow, that I think is the beginning to addressing that question. Sorry, Sean.
Great, thank you, Liv. So we're running to the end of our time here. We do have 2 questions for previous presenters in the queue. So if everyone's okay with that, we'll just circle back quickly to answer those questions. Does that work for everyone?
Hey, Sam, this is Megan. I have to go. So I'm gonna pop off unless there's a quick question for me.
There is a quick question for you. So username Smog77 says, did you find a difference in the perception of people by gender, age, or type of job?
I did not find a difference for gender or age. We did ask about type of job. And yeah.
Okay, great.
That's the answer. Yeah,
great.
Sorry, thank you everybody for great presentations. I'm sorry I have to leave.
Thanks so much, Megan. Okay, and then the last question that we have in the queue is for Lisa, if you're still with us.
Yes.
Richard Seeger asks, does food security increase or decrease with proportion of food grown by the household?
So more households in those that we rank as less food secure consume from their own production. And the type of crops that they produce are millet, sorghum, and maize. Rice, as we know it, is usually bought from the market in Senegal. So this result is consistent with the argument that less food secure households are engaging in climate sensitive activities such as agriculture. And to follow up, we produced a graph showing the proportion of food consumed from own production and the proportion of food bought cash from the market within the least and most food secure clusters. And I will be very happy to share that with Richard if that's of interest.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think that's the end of our presentation. John, would you like to make any final remarks?
Just to thank you in particular, but all our presenters. This is not an easy thing to do, and I think it went over quite well. I don't know how many people were watching at any one time, but there were wonderful presentations and good questions. I hope we don't have to do this again, but we will definitely have this symposium again in the fall with a different set of people. And I look forward to everybody participating in that. We have finished our postdoc selection for this year. There will be another one later this year. So if there's any Ph.D. students about to complete, please keep in mind that we have a postdoc program at the Earth Institute, and you can see the sorts of things, the diverse sorts of things people are doing, and how interesting they are and how important they are. So thanking you all again, and thanking those of you who have put on your silly speakers, headphones and speakers, and gotten through the last 2 hours. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.